Think forward. Think Research Channel.
There's a structural problem with genocide, which is that it tends to happen in places that are off the beaten path.
So now, in order to promote nonviolence and reduce violence, ultimately we have to address the motivation.
Society needs to acknowledge that learning is a lifelong challenge.
The sit-ins challenge cherished beliefs most whites held dearly.
At the DNA level, we're all 99.9% the same. All of us.
So individuals do matter. And I think the quality of our individual leadership matters.
Who is speaking for poor people? 40 million Americans make $6 an hour. Who is speaking for them?
The only thing that one has after throwing everything overboard is the love that one can give.
William Raspberry, welcome to Explorations in Black Leadership. Thank you so much for being here.
It's a pleasure and a joy to be here.
Well, I want to begin with a question about Brown versus Board of Education. Do you remember what it meant to you at the time you heard about it, the first you heard about it?
I do. And it seemed utterly impossible. I was in small town Mississippi at the time. And I thought, that's all very nice, but boy, it ain't ever going to happen here. I thought I knew whites in the South, and I thought, this just ain't going to happen. And slowly I started to believe that, hey, maybe it could. And now I've reached the point where I still believe maybe it could.
I see. All these years later.
It hasn't yet.
So I guess that leads into the next question. At the time, you thought it wouldn't mean what it promised to mean. What do you think it's turned out to mean now, these 52 years later?
It turned out to establish something that I thought was, and still think, is very important. And that is that the government has no business, at all its levels, has no business making odious separations of people based on race and other irrelevancies. That was an important thing to establish. It was important to drive home the fact that it was damaging. I mean, quite apart from the legal implications, it's damaging psychologically to children to be told that you may not attend this school because of the color of your skin. Unfortunately, we went on to make another, and I think also damaging conclusion, when we said by implication, and I mean we, the black communities, said by implication, and to some extent still say, that what's wrong with this school is that there are too many kids in it who look like you. That's also psychologically damaging and destructive. I'm awfully glad Brown happened. It wasn't enough. And unfortunately, we still, half a century later, haven't figured out what enough would look like. We don't know what to do about the education of our children, especially poor black kids in the cities.
You wrote in a 1982 Post column that black Americans had a choice between being educated or integrated, or both integrated and educated, and made being integrated the top priority. And the results you wrote are socially questionable and educationally disastrous. What do you mean by that?
I didn't think I was that smart back in '82.
Yes, you
no,
were.
What I meant by that was a series of things. First is that for middle-class black children, already imbued with the values of their middle-class parents, the education part had already happened, and integration was the next logical step for them. What they did, though, was to make this a general prescription, not as a logical next step for people who were already made a substantial step, but as a curative step for those who hadn't. And it doesn't work. It doesn't work as a remedy. And what I meant in that column is that when you devote major effort and major financial, economic, and political capital to getting the integration to happen, you don't have very much left to make education happen. And we went for a good while without the necessary attention to making education happen. I think it's one of the things that accounts for the situation we're in today, where we've got neither education or integration.
Now, in 1987, and you must get tired of having your words quoted and ask about things in the past, or maybe not. You said, civil rights tempts us to think in terms of distribution and enforcement when we ought to be thinking of discipline and exertion. Let's talk about that.
Boy, the words do come back, don't they? I guess I can't say I was taken out of context. No, I really do believe that. Let me say what I mean about that. There were things that were done during that period we remember as the civil rights movement that were absolutely vital for our future. I mean, laws were enacted, practices were installed or stopped, and we called on America to change, white America, and it changed. It made possible some things that we couldn't have accomplished without that change, no matter how virtuous we were as individuals. The exemplar we used to use, as a description of segregation and housing, for instance, that even Ralph Bunche, who was our Colin Powell, I guess, in those days, even Ralph Bunche couldn't buy a house in a white neighborhood, and how awful that was. And he was our symbol of virtue. We were asserting that our virtue was not the problem. It was racism that was the problem, and that needed to be overcome. And we made some significant strides in doing that. But what I remember, and what seems to me important, is that there were always both internal and external barriers to our progress. In those days, during the movement, the external barriers were critical. No matter what we did internally wouldn't matter much as long as those barriers stayed in place. So it was a good, noble fight, and I'm awfully glad we did it and that we won. We haven't quite figured out what to do with that victory, though. In my own view, we've reached the point, and it's a landmark point, where the internal barriers are now more significant to our progress than the external ones. The external ones aren't gone, just as the internal ones were gone back in the 60s. But they they are less an impediment. The external barriers are less an impediment now than the internal habits we've accrued, and we haven't quite got our minds around that. Because we couldn't change the culture in the 60s, we could only make righteous demand. We made it, and it was effective. And that piece says that we formed the habit of believing that righteous demand was enough to address all our issues. Some of the issues, including those that I think predominate now among many parts of our population, don't lend themselves to righteous demand. You can't righteously demand that your children be educated. You can demand a place in school. Well, we've got a place in school. But commitment to learning, to study, the things that really do make education pay off don't lend themselves to righteous demand. You could demand a new school or a new traffic light or new anything. And while you slept, the government, if you made enough noise about it, might deliver. You might wake up and look out your window in the morning and see a shiny new traffic light where 3 kids had been killed, in the years before. You won't wake up in the morning and see a truck unloading education for your children on your front lawn. Your children have to go out there and get it. It has to be there. And we made sure during the days of the movement that it was there. We now have to make sure that our children are prepared to go out and grasp it. Otherwise, it won't matter that it's there.
This is not a quote from a column, but the researcher who put this together summarized it in this case. Worse, an obsession with finding examples of persistent racism without inhibits solving more tractable and pressing problems from within. Is that what you were talking about a moment ago?
I don't know what that means, but it sounds sort of like yeah, I think it's very difficult to multitask on racial disadvantage. King talked about the necessity for what he called a rhythmic alternation between dealing with causes and curing conditions. It's so easy to achieve a position of leadership if you hand the people who are in trouble a scapegoat for their condition. This is the villain who caused the peace. Yeah. And I can cheer that because it's always right. It's always correct. But it's not always helpful. And if you attempt to lead by saying, they've been awful to us, but what needs to be done next is up to us to do, and we have to forget them for a little while, perhaps, or let somebody else deal with their sins, and we have to deal with our own shortcomings. That doesn't catapult you into leadership. And even people, no matter how well-intentioned they may be, find it difficult to resist what I consider the applause lines of blaming the enemy for our shortcomings. And it's not the reverse of blaming the victims. It's a matter of getting the analysis right, or at least right enough so that you can make some progress. Because that, to me, is the name of the game, moving from the condition we're in to nearer the condition we hope to achieve. If blaming makes that happen, then baby boy blame. But it doesn't anymore make it happen. And it's finally necessary, I think, to change some of the things we do and some of the things we teach our children. because we have reached that unprecedented place in African American history, where for the first time, what we do matters more than what is done to us. It does not say, and somebody will always hear you to say this, it does not mean that what is done to us is insignificant. It continues to be significant. But what we do for the first time matters more.
That nice segue into the next question. And again, going back to Brown, how has the Brown decision in '54 affected your life today and in the intervening years? I know you went to an integrated college, so Brown had little impact, I would guess, on that. But you've had a preoccupation, some would say, with education and now are engaged in a project in your own hometown. So what has Brown meant to you in that sense over these many years? Professionally, I guess.
Brown has meant a lot of things, some psychological, some practical, some, to have the nation's highest court say what we already knew is still profoundly important, I think, that we are full-fledged human Americans. No subcategories. We are full-fledged Americans. Our humanity is complete. That's a reassuring notion to internalize and to have other people who doubted our humanity to internalize. So it's meant that. It's meant the opportunity for vastly improved education for a huge segment of the black middle class. It's meant a number of things. It meant school improvement in a lot of cases. What it didn't mean, though, and what it didn't accomplish, is a significantly improved education for the poorest and most damaged of African Americans in the rural areas and in the big cities. It wasn't that anybody made a decision not to help those kids. We just sort of thought that if we help the ones who are least damaged, the help will eventually trickle down to those who are most damaged, and it hasn't. You mentioned the effort I've been making in my hometown of Okolona, Mississippi. One significant fact about that town is that the schools, 52 years after Brown, are officially desegregated. In fact, about 99% African American. There's no point in talking about solving Okolona's education problems through some racial tinkering or some racial accusation or some racial guilt. We've got to deal with the kids we've got and with the resources we have. It's also clear to me that there are things that our children suffer that we try to address, but we almost always try to address them by giving the schools one more thing to do. And the schools can hardly do what they're primarily charged with doing, which is to teach our children. And I started thinking about the children in my hometown. A hometown that, by the way, had given me a good start in life back before Brown v. Board. And looking at those youngsters and thinking, there's some more Bill Raspberry scattered among them, some more potential that, if we are not careful, will go unrealized. What can we do? And the thought occurred to me that so many of our children begin school begin kindergarten already behind. And how does this happen? Because they fail to get the kind of start that is best for learning back home. Not because their parents are wicked, but because their parents don't always know what to do. So I undertook 3 years ago, back in 2003, to teach the parents of preschoolers in my hometown what they can do at home to get their children ready for learning and for life.
What are those things? What do they learn?
First, they're relearning what we used to know, that education is magical, that it is life transforming if you let it be. We're talking about a generation of parents, and I'm talking now about young parents, including many school dropouts, who no longer believe that education is magical. It didn't work for them. That's why they dropped out and had a little Stephanie when they were 17 or 16 or 18. They want their children to do well. They love them. They spend precious money on dressing them to make them look cute. And I say to them, or we say to them, know you love your kids, but suppose we said we can give you something that will matter more for their lives long term than those cute Weeboks you've got on their feet, which will be too small, in a few months anyway. Suppose we said we can give you something that'll change their life down the road, make it better. Would you be interested? Well, of course they'd be interested. Let me say, I know what you're thinking. We're talking about education, and you think there's nothing you can do to help your child be successful academically because you weren't. What do you know? I say, look, you're your child's first teacher, like it or not. And every single day you get up in the morning, you're teaching your kid. We're not talking about whether you should teach your child. We're talking about what you'll teach your child. You can teach your child that his life or her life will be pretty much the same as yours. Or you'll teach your child that he or she has the prospect of a vastly changed life trajectory, that something wonderful can happen if we start now and prepare to make it happen.
And surely people buy into this and say, sure, sign me up, I'll do it. Have you thought about the people who say, no, it's not for me, or I don't have the time, or I don't have the energy?
Nobody says not for me. Nobody says I don't want it.
Yeah.
They signal they don't want it by not showing up.
Right.
They're with everything. They're the early adapters who will show up every time you say that life's going to be better for my kids. Yeah, I want some of that. And there's a second ring of people who will come in kind of reluctantly. And there's a third ring that will say, let me see how this goes, and then I may step up. We're affecting the third ring. There's a fourth ring that, I think I won't be able to reach. I'm not smart enough to reach. But if we can reach a critical mass of parents of young children, I think we begin to transform what happens in schools. I'm already, I committed to doing birth to 5, that is parents of children from birth to 5. It's already clear to me that when the 5-year-old becomes 6 or 7 and enters the public schools, we can't walk away from those parents. The things we've tried to teach them and the attitudes we've tried to instill in them will still be important. So we'll have to find the ways and means of following them into the schools. But you ask what we do, what we teach them. Sure, attitudes are among the things that I think are critical. The beginnings of a new belief in themselves as parents and their own efficacy. But there are specific things that they can be taught to do. Talk to your kids. Talk to your children. It can be quite astounding to watch how little conversation happens between parent and child at some of the lower income levels. The studies have been done on this, that as you come down the socioeconomic ladder, there is less conversation between parent and child. All parents, according to one study, Todd Risley's study, says that all parents do pretty much the same amount of what he calls business talk. Bring me my shoes, hang your coat up, stop. We all do about the same amount of that. At the lowest socioeconomic spot, that's all that happens. And if you spend time with a middle-class mom or dad and their toddlers, there's this incessant chatter that's going on, both ways. This is language formation. It promotes reading readiness, although that's not what it's meant to do. It's a kind of a bond. It's what they do. But it's fun trying to teach taciturn parents to be chatterers, but it's important. And they enjoy it's fun for them too. We're not taking them to the woodshed all the time. We're saying, here are things you can do, here are things you can talk about. Reading to their kids every night is something they can do. Using stuff that's around the kitchen to teach initial letter sounds is something they can do and enjoy learning to do. Talking to them about health choices, a little trickier because moms are often making poor health choices themselves, and it's hard to enforce. But if you can help people to believe that what they do will make a difference for their children's life chances, you can get their attention.
I would think that would be the initial hardest barrier, to convince parents that their children's outcomes can be different than theirs because of the interaction or intervention of the parent. Once you've over that hurdle, I would think it'd be easy. But
it's not easy, but once you're over that hurdle, it becomes possible.
Okay.
And you are exactly right. That is the critical barrier. You don't have to convince parents to love their children. They do that automatically and naturally. But they don't have much basis for believing in their own efficacy as parents. They haven't been reinforced. They haven't seen any good come of it. So our task is to do some modeling and make that happen.
now, after 3 years, is it too early to say this has been successful, this didn't work too well?
You sound like a funder. Yes, it's too early. It's not too early to begin the measurements, and we've got a brilliant woman in Mississippi whose specialty is assessment, who's doing this for us, and we will have some numbers, and she's already been talking to the parents and children. In the Baby Steps program, I think I forgot to tell you that's what we call it, Baby Steps. We talk to people who are in Baby Steps and people who are not, and they try to assess certain pre-literacy competencies and so on. That's at a pay grade higher than mine. I think it's something we need to do, so I just keep doing it.
You know, as an aside, in '64 in the Freedom Summer of Mississippi, we had freedom schools for kids. About 3,000 kids went to these schools. Only anecdotal evidence will tell you that some of them flowered and flourished. At the 25th anniversary of Freedom Summer, we had a reunion, and a teacher went back to Hattiesburg and met 3 girls who are now women who had been Freedom School students. They were children of single mothers and had all the demographics that you'd say means failure for these women. 2 of them were doctors, one I'm a lawyer. And I've always been curious why some graduate student, and I try to get my graduate students to do it, to go back and capture this cohort. We have the names, easy to find, and compare them with those who didn't have this experience and see whether this single summer of a broadened educational experience might not have had some large effect. But anyway,
a brilliant.
Oh, sure it would be. But let's not get distracted by this.
Maybe well. Okay.
I don't even know if they were in your county in '64. But at any rate, maybe some of the mothers of these children are kids who were in those schools all those years ago. But let me move on. And this is pertinent to what you've just been talking about. In your own life, your personal life, who are the people who were most helpful to you in developing your talents and developing whom you are today? And I notice you've made a distinction between mentors and role models. Talk about that a bit.
Yeah. The smartest thing I did early on was to choose my parents very, very wisely. I had 2 terrific parents. I've still got one of them. My mom, whom I saw 4 days ago, is 100 years old.
Oh.
And a lovely woman. She's still living in her own house. But she and my father, through I don't know what means, managed to acquire some child-rearing skills that were phenomenal. They didn't manage to acquire much money ever. They were both teachers. And there was, we were never hungry or less than properly clothed, but the clothing was not always the good stuff that some of the kids were wearing. We didn't feel poor. What they did was, because they loved learning so much themselves, we absorbed that, all 5 of us. We were forever reading things. My sister used to read in the shower. You know, I mean, and my own children have kept that habit going, which makes me appreciate the power of observation. But somehow they were able to instill in us first a love of learning. They were able also, in Okolona, Mississippi, segregated and awful for us, they were able to make us feel that we were okay, valuable people, and the center of their lives. They were able to make us believe that no matter what happened around us and to us, we were to behave like raspberry kids. I mean that meant something in those days, you know. That other people's mistreatment of us did not relieve us of the responsibility of behaving decently in the world. They never quite said it that way. They would chide us for things, but more importantly, they modeled what they believed.
Where did they get this?
I don't know
Where
where
did
they
this
got
come
it.
to them from?
I saw these attitudes reflected in both my maternal and paternal grandparents, especially the grandfathers. And I suppose some of it came from there. I'm sure if you ask them, they couldn't tell you where it came from. But I mean, this is the part of it that strikes me as powerful. When it happens and however it happens, you can recognize its power and how it makes you feel. And it makes you want to pass it along. So once you get infected with this gene, whatever it is, it can, with a little help, replicate itself down the generations. By the same token, if you get infected with an attitude that says nothing you do matters, and that vengeance is a proper response, that getting even is more important than getting ahead, that's heritable too. And I see kids, I used to see kids on the playground who would fight because their parents had instructed them you don't take nothing off nobody, and if anybody does anything to you, you hit them with a rock or you stab them with a pencil and they thought they were teaching their kids to take care of themselves because they loved their kids. So what my own experience, both at my house, and I do mean it when I say my parents were sort of incredible. There's another thing about my early years, though, that's also extremely important, I think. I was born on the campus of what was then Okolona College, a little 2-year college with a 4-year high school attached. It was a campus setting, dormitories, the whole thing. That's where I was born. That's where my dad taught building trades. It was, at that time, the only 4-year high school for blacks in Chickasaw County. But there was that little school, supported by the Episcopal Church, that saw as its mission preparing young black kids to succeed in a hostile environment. The people there, I think I remember one PhD the whole time college existed. These were people who were not extraordinary scholars or particularly gifted teachers, but they were so committed to saving a generation of us in the heat of segregation, that they really did transform our lives. I'm talking about a surprising number of people who came through that little high school and college who went on to do well. And the presence of that little school helped to transform our town into what these days we would call a learning community, at least for the black half of the town. And we had some effect on the other, but I'm principally talking about what happened to black kids and black families in that town in those days. And it was really quite extraordinary in ways that I didn't realize until I left the place. And that experience of observing at firsthand what a few committed people can do to lift the sights of people who didn't have much previous reason for lifting their eyes. That's also part of what drives the baby steps effort. I don't want to recreate the little college. There's no point in doing that. But I came to understand, and understand more every day as I look back, the importance of changing the culture, the cultural attitudes toward learning. Learning is in disrepute in some parts of our country. It's thought to be an effete kind of thing. And acting is more important than merely learning. And in our own little way, Baby Steps hopes to get people thinking about creating, once again, a learning community in our town. We also hope to transform the town racially as well. The town is almost equally divided between black and white, and we haven't figured out yet, except at the edges, how to live together. There's some people who want to do it, who are trying on both sides. But I think it occurred to me once again that we will argue about politics and religion and whether to put the park here or the school there. The one thing we're all agreed on is that we want our children to do well. I mean, it's the one. I mean, you ask for a show of hands of those who are opposed to children, and you don't get anybody waving their hands about. So it's about the only thing I can think of where we all agreed, and waiting for somebody to give us something to do, to act on that agreement.
Now, besides these academics and your own parents and teachers, I guess, are there other figures in your early life that had an impact on you?
They are, and there are such people, and I will miss some of them, but let me name one by way of illustrating a point that I think is important. We talk to our youngsters today, as early as junior high, and we tell them the importance of studying and staying in school, making good grades, because a college graduate earns this much, and a high school graduate only earns this much, and a high school dropout only earns this much. So you see how important it is that you stay in school and do well. And I roll back to my childhood, and I think, I did not study a single hour or write a single paper or pass a single examination with an eye on my economics 20 years down the road. It just wasn't a part of my thought process. You know, for kids, long term is the weekend after next. I worked hard in school to please adults who cared about me. My parents, of course. But Mr. Gardner was my math teacher. And he was a wonderful man. And he liked me, and it was so important for me to have him think well of me that I wanted to ace his algebra courses. And I did so well under Mr. Gardner that my first major when I went away to college was math. I just thought, I wanted to be like Mr. Gardner. There were other people on campus. One man who taught me agriculture. I didn't learn that much about cover crops and that kind of thing. But he was the only teacher I remember who would take us high school boys aside and talk to us about life, which is to say about sex And it was profoundly important to us because we weren't getting it anywhere else. I wasn't, God bless them, getting it. I was not getting it from my parents at home. My parents never, I think, uttered the word sex to any of their 5 children. We never had the talk. I thought I was the only one who missed it. But I talked to my older sisters and they said, no, no, no. What they would do is, when those important faces arose, they would find little tracts and books and magazines and leave them lying around in the living room, confident that we'd find them and read them.
Pick them up. Yeah.
But they never uttered a word.
Let me ask you, do you remember any specific national or local historical events that were regularly discussed in your home around the dinner table? And if so, how did these events shape your consciousness?
Boy, that's a hard question because I haven't thought of it. Look, I was born in 1935, so my first memories of important national events were World War II.
Right.
And the impact of that on what we did, what we ate, what happened to our cousins who went off to fight in the war and all of that.
Did you have a victory garden?
We had a survival garden. We always had a garden.
Okay.
We had a garden and always a few chickens running around in the yard. What we did have was blackout curtains. I remember one phase of my life, we were living in a house that did not have electricity. We had kerosene lamps that were so dim you had to do a double take to see if anybody was home. And yet we bought these thick green and or black blackout shades. And when the air raid warning siren went off, we dutifully lowered our blinds. I said, the Japanese couldn't have found Okolona if we set the town on fire, let alone turning off the light. But we were dutiful and patriotic and cared about. I mean, and we didn't resent the fact that shoes and sugar and meat and candy bars were rationed. That was our little contribution to the war effort.
Right. You were part of the war effort.
Yes.
What about other events after the war? Do you remember the war's end?
I'm sorry?
Do you remember the war's end?
The war's end, yes. I remember, sharing a celebratory mood. I didn't understand what any of this was about. I do remember wondering, what will the headlines of the paper be now? Because they were every day about the war. And I couldn't imagine what they used to be about. We didn't have as many dinner table conversations, or didn't overhear as many adult conversations about politics as we would now. Roosevelt, yeah, on the national level, but we were shut out of state and local politics. We knew vaguely who was running our lives, but there was nothing we could do about it. My mother, by the way, I was in college when my mother became the first black woman in Chickasaw County to register to vote.
Really?
I was already gone. So I had a vague recollection of their interest in politics, but not strong. They used to talk a lot about how people behaved. And one of the things that I remember so well is that in this little, I almost want to say poverty-stricken home, for most of my childhood, there was at least one other person, not a family member, living with us to go to this little school on whose campus I lived. So it became almost second nature that, you know, a spare bed would be put somewhere and another cup of water in the soup, and it was this was what families did if they had a little to share and spare. And I didn't realize what sort of impact this had made on me personally until my wife and I found ourselves taking a 13-year-old foster son into our home some years ago, because it seemed the natural thing to do. The kid, a decent kid, needed a place to stay, needed a home, needed some parents. And I think what I'm saying is that little seeds get planted in ways that you don't even suspect, and they will sprout at times in places that surprise you. You don't know. And it makes me, I'm almost glad I didn't know this early on. I think it would make you crazy as a parent if you really understood the influence of what your ordinary day-to-day behavior has on your children. I mean, it's scary, but it can be quite profound.
Now, moving ahead, how'd you choose your career? I understand you had multiple majors in college. What were your majors?
As I said, I started off as a math major, partly to please Mr. Gardner, my math teacher, and partly because my father, who taught building trades, would, in a fairer world, have been an engineer. I'm sure of that. And I thought maybe I could be the engineer that Dad couldn't become, because here was my disease. They had filled me with confidence that I was smart enough to do whatever I set my mind about doing. And I really believed that. I was halfway through college before I found out it wasn't true. I ran into organic chemistry and discovered that I couldn't do anything I wanted to do. At any rate, I thought I could do whatever I put my mind to, but I didn't know what I wanted to do. And I found myself reacting to what people I cared about and who cared about me said I should do. Oh, you're good in math, you should be a math major. You're really good with English. You can spot a gerund or a participial phrase across the campus, you know. You ought to be an English major. So I was an English major for a time. I was, at one point, I was a history major because somebody said something else. And then at one point, some people came round to say that the church, the Episcopal Church, needed priests. They invited a bunch of us males off to visit Virginia Theological Seminary in Alexandria, Virginia, my first time in Washington, in fact, to tell us that if we thought we could be a lawyer or a doctor or an engineer, but also thought we could be a priest, we ought to give that some consideration. So I became a pre-seminarian and was going to become an Episcopal priest, except that I was running out of money for school. Scholarships were not quite as prevalent then as they are now. And I had to work my way through college. And this particular summer, it was between my junior and senior years, I'd had trouble finding a job. And my reentry into school that September was in doubt. It was July already, and I was sweating it. And that July day, a friend of mine who worked for the Indianapolis Recorder called and said, "The sports editor just quit. If you're willing to pass yourself off as a sports writer, I think I can get you hired." So I went down to the Recorder and told Mr. Stewart I was a sports writer and got hired that day.
Were you a sports writer?
I wasn't the writer of any sort. I didn't know anything about sports. I liked sports, and it took him about a week to discover that I really wasn't his next sports editor. But I was by then very good with subject-verb agreements. I'd been an English major for a little while. Right. And Mr. Stewart liked that. And I had one other quality that he absolutely adored: my willingness to work for the minimum wage. So he put me on that July. And when September came around and it was time to go back to school, he came to me and said, go and find out what your school schedule is, and any hours you're not working, you're not in school, you can work here. He gave me a Leica 3F 35 millimeter camera. I said, go learn how to take pictures. And he just sort of gave me my head and let me learn to be a journalist. And I spent 4 years at that place. I went back to school that fall, and then worked at the Recorder and went to school for a while. Then when I finished school, I stayed there until I got drafted in the Army. So the Indianapolis Recorder was my fifth major. That was my journalism major, although I never took a journalism course in school. It was my J school.
But you learned at the Recorder the things that you might have learned had you gone to J school.
Some of them.
How to write a lead.
How to write leads, how to write headlines, how to structure a story. But I learned something I think that I'm not sure I would have learned in journalism school. I had been writing papers for my college professors, and they were, good in the sense that they tended to be grammatically correct, and I learned little tricks about, sticking in short sentences after a series of longer ones, but they were not. I'm glad I can't find any of them now. But I was writing then for an audience of one who had to read my work. The first thing that hit me when I went to the Indianapolis Recorder was that nobody has to read what I'm writing. Nobody has to read it. And this was a worrisome thing to me. And I learned not because somebody taught me about leads, but because I was afraid that I'd do all this work and nobody would read it.